I need you to listen carefully tonight, because what I am about to reveal is something we depended on when I was deep inside witchcraft. It was simple, quiet, and almost impossible to detect, which is exactly why it was so effective. We were taught that the most dangerous rituals are never the dramatic ones. Not the candles, not the chanting, not the circles on the floor. The rituals that caused the greatest spiritual damage were always disguised as harmless curiosity. One of those rituals involved something nearly every home already has: salt water. And even more chilling, it involved your name. I remember the first time I saw it happen. I was still being trained, still learning how spiritual doors are opened without people realizing it. A senior practitioner placed a bowl of water on the table and slowly poured salt into it. Then she wrote a name on a small piece of paper. No shouting, no strange language, just silence. She looked at me and said something I will never forget. Most people will participate in their own spiritual bondage if you make it sound protective. That sentence stayed with me long after I left the occult. Because here is the truth many believers do not realize. The enemy rarely approaches you with something that looks evil. He prefers suggestions that look wise, protective, even spiritual. Try this for protection. Do this to remove negative energy. Put your name in salt water to cleanse your life. It sounds harmless. But inside the occult, salt water was never just salt water. It symbolized agreement. Agreement is what gives spiritual actions permission to operate. Let me be very clear. Salt itself is not evil. Water is not evil. But rituals built on symbolic surrender can quietly establish spiritual consent. And consent, even when given unknowingly, has consequences. Tonight, many people across the world will try things they saw online. Not because they are rebellious, not because they hate God, but because they are searching for relief, protection, answers. And desperation makes people experiment with doors they would normally never touch. When I left witchcraft, one of the first things that shocked me was how many believers were unknowingly repeating practices that mirrored occult principles, not intentionally, but blindly. This is why I speak now, not to create fear, but to awaken discernment. If someone told you tonight to place your name in salt water, you might think you are doing something symbolic for peace or cleansing. But what if the real question is this? Who taught the world that rituals replace prayer? Because once a believer starts trusting objects more than God, the shift has already begun. And what I am about to reveal in the next chapter will explain why practices like this were never random, and why the enemy prefers believers who act before they discern. So before you try anything tonight, pause, because understanding always protects those who are willing to listen. What I am about to share next may surprise you, because it challenges something many people assume, that spiritual danger always looks dark, obvious, or frightening. Inside the occult, we believe the exact opposite. The quieter the ritual, the stronger its reach. You see, dramatic rituals attract suspicion, but simple acts slip past discernment. When something looks harmless, the mind relaxes, and when the mind relaxes, spiritual caution often disappears with it. Saltwater rituals were especially valued for this reason. Not because salt had power on its own, but because symbolism creates spiritual language, and spiritual language operates through agreement. We were taught a principle very early. People do not have to understand the spiritual action for it to represent consent. They only have to participate. Let that settle for a moment. Participation is what matters. I remember being told if they write their own name, the doorway opens wider. At the time, I didn't question it. Questioning was discouraged. Obedience was praised. Looking back now, I realized something chilling. Most people believe danger comes from what others do to them. But often the enemy prefers when people involve themselves. Why? Because self-involvement reduces resistance. Think about it. A believer might immediately reject something that looks like witchcraft, but present it as spiritual cleansing, energy removal, or protection, and suddenly curiosity replaces caution. Curiosity is not evil, but unguarded curiosity can lead people into imitation without discernment. Here is something many never realize about the spiritual realm. Intention this clears throat, not automatically equal protection. Someone can intend peace and still step into confusion if the foundation is misplaced. That is why Scripture consistently redirects believers away from rituals and back toward relationship, away from objects and toward authority in God. Inside witchcraft, we actually counted on people searching for quick solutions. The faster the promise, the more attractive it became. Do this tonight. Instant cleansing, immediate breakthrough, but spiritual maturity rarely grows in the soil of shortcuts. Now hear me clearly. I am not telling you this so you become fearful of everything. Fear clouds judgment just as much as ignorance does. I am telling you so you become anchored, because anchored believers are very difficult to influence. When I first walked away from the occult, one realization hit me harder than anything else. The safest believers were never the most emotional. They were the most grounded. They didn't chase mystical experiences. They didn't experiment with spiritual trends. They tested what they heard. They paused before participating. They asked, does this draw me closer to God, or does it subtly replace trust with technique? That question alone protects more doors than people realize. So if you ever hear instructions that sound spiritual, but bypass prayer, wisdom, and relationship with God, slow down. You do not have to react to every suggestion that circulates. Discernment often begins with a pause. And in the next chapter, I want to show you something even deeper. The hidden reason these practices spread so quickly, and why believers who lack spiritual confidence are often the primary targets, because the enemy is not searching for perfect people. He is searching for unaware ones. There is something I need you to understand now that many people completely miss when conversations about rituals come up. The true objective was never the paper, never the bowl, and never even the name itself. The real target was always trust. Inside the occult, we understood a spiritual pattern that most believers are rarely taught. Whatever you place your trust in begins to shape your dependence, and dependence over time quietly redirects your faith. That is why practices like placing your name in salt water were never treated casually. Where I came from, they were viewed as symbolic exchanges, small actions that gradually trained a person to look for solutions outside of God. Not instantly, not dramatically, but subtly, very subtly. You must understand the enemy is patient. He is far more interested in slow shifts than sudden collapses. Sudden attacks get attention. Slow replacements go unnoticed. First, a believer tries one symbolic act just in case. Then another when life is uncertain. Then another when prayers seem delayed. And without realizing it, their confidence begins migrating away from spiritual authority and toward physical methods. I watched this happen more times than I can count. People rarely woke up one day intending to misplace their trust. It happened gradually, one harmless-looking step at a time. But here is the freedom I want you to hear today. Believers who understand where their authority comes from cannot be easily redirected. Your authority was never designed to come from objects. It was never meant to come from rituals, and it was certainly never meant to come from fear-driven experiments. It comes from your alignment with God. When I left the occult, one of the hardest things for me to relearn was simplicity. No formulas, no hidden steps, no symbolic transactions, just prayer, just trust. At first, clears throat. It felt almost too simple because I had spent years believing power had to be activated through complicated means. But the deeper I walked in faith, the clearer it became. What is rooted in God does not need theatrical support. Now, let me gently address something that may already be stirring in your mind. Some of you watching may have tried things like this before, maybe out of curiosity, maybe during a difficult season, maybe because someone you trusted recommended it. Hear me. This is not a moment for shame. Awareness is where freedom begins. Fear says, "What have I done?" Wisdom says, "Now that I see clearly, I choose differently." There is a huge difference. Remember, this God is not intimidated by your past participation in something you didn't fully understand. Grace meets awareness the moment you turn toward truth. So do not allow guilt to whisper louder than growth. Instead, let this knowledge anchor you. Because once your trust is firmly rooted in God, suggestions lose their pull, trends lose their urgency, and spiritual shortcuts lose their appeal. You stop chasing methods and start walking in maturity. But what I am about to reveal next is something we counted on heavily, something far more influential than curiosity. In the next chapter, we are going to uncover why moments of vulnerability often become the doorway through which these ideas enter, and why emotionally exhausted believers were always considered the easiest to influence, not because they were weak, but because they were tired. There is a pattern I began noticing very early during my time in the occult. A pattern so consistent that it was never questioned. We were trained to observe people not just spiritually, but emotional exhaustion often creates spiritual openness without discernment. Let me explain what I mean. The people who were most likely to experiment with symbolic rituals were rarely rebellious. They were rarely careless. Most of the time they were simply tired. Tired of delays. Tired of unanswered prayers. Tired of fighting the same battles, tired of hoping things would change. And when exhaustion settles into the heart, something dangerous can quietly follow. Urgency. Urgency makes people reach for fast solutions. Inside the occult, we understood something many believers never hear taught. A weary person is not weak, but they are more vulnerable to suggestion, not because their faith is gone, but because their relief feels overdue. So when an idea appeared promising immediate peace, cleansing, or breakthrough, it often bypassed careful discernment, not intentionally, but emotionally. I remember being told very clearly, watch for the ones who are losing patience with waiting. They will be the first to try something new. At the time, it sounded strategic. Now looking back, it sounds heartbreaking because waiting seasons are not signs that God has forgotten you. Yet they are often the very seasons where believers begin wondering if they need to help something happen. Hear this gently. Whenever you feel pressured to force spiritual movement, pause. God does not operate through panic. The enemy rushes. God leads. There is a deep difference between expectation and desperation. Expectation is anchored in trust. Desperation searches for substitutes. Saltwater rituals, symbolic cleansings, and spiritual shortcuts often spread fastest during seasons when people feel stuck. But what many do not realize is that maturity is frequently formed in the waiting, not in the instant. When I walked away from witchcraft, one truth reshaped my entire understanding of spiritual strength. Delayed does not mean denied. Many believers misinterpret silence as absence when sometimes it is simply preparation happening beneath the surface. Think of a tree long before growth is visible. Roots are pushing deeper into the ground, no applause, no evidence above soil, yet stability is forming. Your spiritual life often develops the same way. So if you are in a season where answers feel slow, do not let frustration talk you into practices that replace trust with control. You were never meant to carry the burden of manufacturing your own breakthrough. Another thing we observed was this. Confident believers were rarely drawn to rituals, not because they had easier lives, but because they had settled something internally. Their help comes from God. Confidence closes many unnecessary doors, but weariness sometimes cracks them open. If that resonates with you today, I want you to hear this clearly. Feeling tired does not make you spiritually fragile. It makes you human. The danger is not the fatigue. The danger is what you reach for while you are fatigued. Instead of reaching for methods, return to presence. Instead of searching for symbols, lean into prayer. Instead of forcing movement, allow God to strengthen you where you stand. Because strength built slowly tends to last longer than relief found quickly. And in the next chapter, I need to show you something that very few people recognize. The subtle difference between symbolic actions and spiritual authority, and why confusing the two can quietly reshape a believer's foundation. Once you see it, you won't unsee it. And that clarity alone will protect you more than you realize. Listen to me carefully, because what I'm about to share is not symbolic. It is not superstition. It is a spiritual countermeasure that many people in the occult fear. You will discover tonight, not tomorrow, not next week, tonight. You are going to take back what was marked. When I was deep in witchcraft, we avoided people who understood spiritual authority. Not loud people, not religious performers, but believers who knew how to close doors. And one of the simplest acts that disrupted monitoring assignments was this. Salt water, your name, prayer, authority. Let me explain why this matters. In the occult, a name is never just a name. Your name represents access, identity, legal, spiritual ground. When a witch wants to track someone, they don't always need your photo or your hair. Your name is often enough to establish a point of focus. But what witches never want you to understand is that you can also reclaim your name. Tonight, take a small bowl, fill it with clean water, add a pinch of salt, not as magic, but as a symbol of separation. Throughout Scripture, salt represented purification, covenant, and preservation. It marks something as set apart. Then write your full name on a small piece of paper. As you place that paper near the bowl or under it, you are making a declaration in the spiritual realms. This life is no longer open territory, but do not perform this like a ritual. Rituals depend on objects. Authority depends on God. Now pray, and pray with firmness, not fear. Say something like this. Every hidden assignment against my life is cancelled. Every monitoring spirit loses access. Every altar speaking my name is silenced. I declare that my identity belongs to God, and no weapon formed against me will prosper. You don't have to shout. You don't have to strive. Just stand in authority, because here is the truth. Most people never hear. Darkness is not terrified of complicated prayers. Darkness is terrified of believers who know who they are. After you pray, leave the bowl overnight as a physical reminder. Not that salt is protecting you, but that you have drawn a spiritual boundary. Then tomorrow morning, throw the water away. Do not keep it. You are making a statement that the past assignments have no place in your future. Now, hear me clearly. Some of you will notice something change after tonight. The strange heaviness may lift, your sleep may deepen, your thoughts may quiet, or, and this is important, resistance may briefly increase. Do not panic if it does. When the occult senses it is losing access, it sometimes attempts one final push, but that push is not proof of their power. It is proof that the door is closing. Remember this forever. You are not the hunted, you are the protected. Before I left witchcraft, I watched strong assignments collapse simply because someone began praying with authority instead of fear. No counterspell could override a life fully surrendered to God. None. So if you have felt watched, drained, opposed, delayed, do this tonight, not as superstition, but as a line in the sand. And as you do, understand something I wish someone had told me years earlier, while I was still trapped in darkness. Light does not struggle to defeat darkness.